Hello and welcome to Security in Context. Today I have the pleasure to speak to Mandy Turner, senior researcher at Security in Context and author of the policy paper Countering Day After Narratives: Notes Towards a Practical Program for Palestinian Liberation and Global Solidarity. Hello, Mandy. How are you doing today?
Hello, Anita. It's really nice to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Sure. So let's start with the title of your policy paper. You argue for the need to counter both the proliferation of day after plans and proposals, as well as the necessity for Palestinians and their allies as well to think ahead. So, could you explain why it's necessary to critique these narratives while also emphasizing the importance of thinking concretely and practically, no, about the future?
Okay, thanks for that question. Before I answer your question, I just wanted to take a few minutes to start off with some facts where we are. Israel's been bombing Gaza for over 5 months. Israel has killed more than 31,000 Palestinians in Gaza and has injured over 73,000, and over 75% of Palestinians in Gaza are now displaced. In the West Bank, we're seeing hundreds of Palestinians arrested. 400 Palestinians have been killed by Israel, including 100 children. And at the same time, what we're seeing is Israeli citizens living illegally in the West Bank attacking Palestinians with impunity and driving them off their land. So we need to place all of this center stage. Why is this happening? This is not just because of Hamas's attacks on October the 7th. And this is what we mean by saying history didn't begin on October the 7th. So any proposals for a day after for Gaza that does not address these issues, that does not acknowledge that these are all caused by Israel's colonization and apartheid regime, will ultimately fail. So I was really interested to look at who is dominating these discussions about the day after. And most of the people discussing them are Israel, the United States, the European Union, and Arab states. But where are the Palestinians in all this? Now, if you look at Palestinian experts such as Diana Buttu, Raja Khalidi, Ala Tartir, Mustafa Barghouti, there's many, many others. They've been repeatedly saying we need to talk about the day before. We need to talk about now. We need to discuss why Oslo failed, because Hamas's attack didn't happen in a vacuum. And it's because of them and many others that they inspired me to write the piece in this way. And I think that Palestinians and their allies have already provided the groundwork for thinking now and thinking ahead. And all I did was try to synthesize years and years of work by human rights experts, by conflict resolution experts, and development experts. We have the knowledge and the frameworks there already. We just can use them in this context. Of course, the issue is the ability to implement them, but we do need to have a practical perspective, and having a framework is important. So I was provoked to write it in this way because of the discussions that we've seen in the media. But I was also starting to feel uncomfortable about constantly saying that decolonization was the answer without thinking through how this could be achieved. And this paper was my first attempt to do so.
Right. And in fact, your article proposes an approach like a tangible approach that consists of three components. First, a reclassification of Israel's occupation as colonialism, which you just referred to. Second, a rights-based approach to conflict resolution. And third, the UN's triple nexus framework. So could you briefly explain what these mean, and what their implications are, what the implications of these three components of this framework that you're proposing are?
So, as I just said earlier, these frameworks are not new. Well, the UN one is fairly new, but it builds on decades of work by development experts and economists. And I use these three frameworks because they deal with key aspects of why the Oslo peace process failed. And they covered the three aspects of law, governance, and development. Now, basically, Oslo failed because it was based on false principles and a wrong analysis of what is going on. First of all, Israel's occupation has become permanent. It probably always was. And now we see a case before the International Court of Justice that's looking at this issue, not the genocide case taken by South Africa, but the other case that's been triggered by a UN General Assembly request to look at whether Israel's occupation has become permanent and therefore illegal. Now, if we look at the way in which Israel has been talking about its plans for the day after a ceasefire, it's saying that it will still control all of the space between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. This is not occupation anymore, this is annexation, and it's also colonization because Israel's settling its own population in the West Bank. It's confiscating Palestinian land and natural resources, and it's destroying Palestinian livelihoods. So, if we reclassify Israel's actions as colonialism, this would shift the focus away from looking at the illegality of the occupation towards looking at the root causes of why Palestinians are still being denied the right to live in freedom and with dignity. And once we do that, there's three conclusions that I go through in the paper. One is that the principle is that colonialism violates Palestinians' right to self-determination. The second conclusion is that the colonial power must withdraw without any condition. So Israel can't say that its security must be primary. And the third conclusion is that an occupied people under colonialism have the right to resist to achieve self-determination. Now, the second framework is a bit more well rehearsed. Palestinians have been saying for decades that a conflict resolution framework with Israel's security as the primary focus is a fundamental part of the problem. So, if we pivot away from this framework towards a rights-based framework, then we're forced to ask the question, whose rights are being infringed? And what do we need to stop these rights being infringed? Then security can only be addressed after everyone's human rights are being protected. Now, within this rights-based approach is also the centrality of Palestinians driving it. So the discussions about destroying Hamas that are coming from Israel, coming from the United States, coming from Europe, this is flawed because Hamas cannot be destroyed. Hamas is a fundamental part of Palestinian politics, and it's important that all factions within Palestine are included in discussions about how to recreate a Palestinian national movement. Now, it's disappointing that talks between the factions haven't seemed to have achieved this so far in terms of having a unified approach, but there are others out there who know much more about this than I do. The third framework I develop in the paper is the UN's triple nexus approach. And the UN's triple nexus approach is all about how to move societies from humanitarian assistance towards sustainable development and peace. And it really draws our attentions to what is blocking this. Why do societies remain dependent upon aid? We know that Israel's been deliberately destroying the Palestinian economy. There's been lots of research undertaken on this by organisations such as the Palestinian Economic Policy Research Institute in Ramallah and UNCTAD. There's a lot of research on how Israel has been deliberately destroying the Palestinian economy. So with a rights-based approach, we would look at what are the obstacles to Palestinian economic development. And the conclusion would be that by working around Israel's restrictions, its movement restrictions, its controls through the Paris Economic Protocol, if we continue to work around these obstacles, we're only really making it worse. And also with the triple nexus, it's like the rights-based approach in that one of the key principles of the triple nexus is that planning and strategies and interventions should be identified and coordinated through mechanisms that are run by Palestinians. So, the framework of decolonisation, rights based conflict resolution, and creating the conditions to shift from humanitarian relief to sustainable development, I felt was a practical framework to talk about, because there's lots of examples of this in history. Decolonisation is not a new phenomenon. Neither is ending apartheid rule. We have historical examples of this. We also have examples of rights based approaches to conflict resolution and strategies to implement the UN's triple nexus. So we can draw on all these examples to develop a particular programme. One of the other things I think is important to bear in mind is that we now have an emerging global alliance of states and civil society actors who are supporting Palestine and Palestinian liberation, which can drive this agenda forward.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you if you wanted to share any concluding thoughts before we wrap up the interview. I was also very interested in this idea of the global alliance that you just mentioned, but I don't know if very briefly you want to add something, or otherwise, we can we can end here. But I'm really looking forward to to reading more of your work.
Thank you. Yeah, I think what we're seeing a lot of activities around the globe. We're seeing it at the multilateral level, at the International Court of Justice, at the International Criminal Court in the UN, and we're also seeing it inside states. So we see in the United States, in the UK, and other countries, there are legal cases being taken against political elites for shielding Israel's attack on Palestinians. We're seeing legal cases being taken against universities or other organizations who have investments in companies that are profiting from the occupation. So there is a global alliance emerging. There was one final thing I would like to mention before we wrap up. And one, it is that we're seeing attacks on people who are proposing decolonisation as an answer to the situation in Israel and Palestine. We've seen critics saying that this is dangerous and false, or even saying that it's anti Semitic. But I would say to these critics, what are your solutions? Are you willing to see Israel's cruel and violent colonial apartheid regime over Palestinians continue? Is the genocide that's currently taking place in Gaza not enough for you to shift your moral compass? I think we can undermine these critics by having clear frameworks and strategies. And we need to have these, otherwise, we're looking at more decades of repression and violence against Palestinians. And this is a program for global solidarity with Palestinians. We need people like me on the outside need to be doing all we can to push forward an agenda that places Palestinian liberation center stage.
Mandy Turner, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you.